December 18th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Temperature hovering just above freezing. Fog so thick a man could barely see 20 meters ahead through the skeletal branches of pine and oak trees that rose like cathedral columns into the grey winter sky. Private James Wright of the 761st Tank Battalion crouched in a foxhole that smelled of pine needles, damp earth, old coffee grounds from abandoned ration tins, and the metallic scent of fear that seemed to permeate everything in those days. He was clutching an empty Coca-Cola bottle like it was the most precious thing in the world, his fingers numb despite his wool gloves, his breath coming in small clouds that dissipated almost instantly in the cold air. He was 17 years old, though his enlistment papers said 19, a lie he had told so smoothly that he almost believed it himself now. He believed, like so many that winter morning, that courage and determination and proper training would be enough to turn the tide of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. He had no idea how profoundly wrong he was about what would save his life that day, or how a moment of pure desperation and improvisation would teach him that survival often depends not on the weapons we carry or the training we receive, but on the split-second decisions we make when every conventional option has vanished and the mind reaches for anything at all, that might change the equation. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What James Wright discovered in the frozen forests of Belgium, in a moment that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but would echo through the remaining 73 years of his life, would challenge everything he thought he knew about warfare, about courage, about technology, and about the thin line between life and its opposite. And in doing so, it would reveal a truth that military historians, psychologists, and tactical analysts would debate for decades afterward. That in the chaos of conflict, human ingenuity and psychological warfare can sometimes achieve what heavy artillery cannot. That the most sophisticated weapon systems are still operated by human beings, subject to fear and imperfect information. And that chance plays a far larger role in determining the outcome of individual encounters than anyone likes to admit. James Wright had enlisted in the United States Army in April of 1944, 3 months after his 17th birthday, a cold January day that he remembered not for his coming of age, but for the argument he had had with his father about the future. The Wright family lived outside of Clarksdale, Mississippi, on land that they did not own, working as sharecroppers on a cotton farm that stretched for hundreds of acres under the relentless sun. James was the fourth of 7 children, 3 boys and 4 girls, and the family dynamics were complex in ways that only become clear when you understand what it meant to be a black family in the rural South in the early 1940s. His father, Samuel Wright, was 42 years old and had never traveled more than 50 miles from the place he was born. He was a man of strong opinions and stronger hands, hardened by decades of farm labor that began when he was 6 years old and would likely continue until his body simply gave out. Samuel had a saying that he repeated often: "You cannot fight the sun, you cannot fight the seasons, and you cannot fight the way things are. The best you can do is survive them." James's mother, Rachel Wright, was 39 and possessed a quiet determination that her children recognized even when her husband did not. She could read and write, skills she had learned from a retired schoolteacher who had taken an interest in her when she was young, and she had taught all of her children to read using whatever books and newspapers she could acquire. She believed in education the way some people believe in religion, as a transformative force that could change lives and create opportunities that did not otherwise exist. James had been a good student at the segregated school he attended when farm work allowed him to go, which was not as often as either he or his mother wished. He particularly excelled at mathematics and history, could calculate crop yields and fair share percentages faster than most adults, and had memorized significant portions of the textbooks his teachers shared among multiple students. His history teacher, Mr. Benjamin Foster, a 63-year-old man who had himself once dreamed of going to college before the realities of the 1900s crushed that dream, had told James something that stayed with him. "Knowledge is the one thing they cannot take from you, boy. Learn everything you can, because that will travel with you wherever you go." The argument with his father in January of 1944 had been about exactly that: going somewhere else. James had announced at dinner, surrounded by his siblings, and with his mother serving beans and cornbread that was their staple, that he intended to enlist in the army. He had read about the need for soldiers, about the units being formed, about the opportunities that military service might provide. He was too young, Samuel had said immediately. He was needed on the farm, Samuel had continued. He was throwing his life away, Samuel had concluded, his voice rising with each statement. But Rachel had put her hand on her husband's arm, a gesture so slight that someone not watching closely might have missed it, and had asked James a single question: "Is this what you truly want?" James had nodded, unable to trust his voice at that moment, and Rachel had said, "Then we will find a way." Finding a way meant altering a birth certificate, a task that required careful work with ink and a steady hand. It meant traveling to the recruitment office in Memphis, a journey of over an hour by bus that used money the family could barely spare. It meant James standing straighter than his actual height, speaking with more confidence than he felt, and looking the recruiter directly in the eye when he said he was 19 years old and ready to serve his country. The recruiter, a sergeant named Miller, who had processed thousands of young men and had developed a sense for truth and lies, looked at James for a long moment. Miller was in his mid-30s, had a scar on his left cheek from some past incident, and eyes that suggested he had seen more than he cared to remember. He looked at James's birth certificate, looked back at James, then asked a question that had nothing to do with age. "Can you follow orders?" James answered, "Yes, sir," without hesitation. "Can you work with others?" "Yes, sir." "Are you afraid of hard work?" "No, sir." Miller had stamped the papers, handed James a form, and told him to report to Camp Hood in Texas in 3 weeks. "Welcome to the Army, Private Wright," Miller had said. "Make us proud." James returned home that evening to a family dinner that was simultaneously celebratory and mournful. His younger siblings asked him excited questions about where he would go and what he would do. His older brother, Robert, who had wanted to enlist himself but had been rejected due to a childhood injury that left him with a permanent limp, gripped James's hand and told him to be careful. His father sat in silence for most of the meal, then finally spoke as James was preparing for bed. "I do not understand this choice, but you are my son and I will not say you are wrong. Just come back to us." His mother packed his small bag the night before he left, including a Bible that had belonged to her mother, a pocket knife that had been his grandfather's, and a photograph of the family taken by a traveling photographer 2 years earlier, one of the few photographs the Wright family owned. She also included 3 letters she had written, one to be opened when he completed training, one to be opened on his first Christmas away from home, and one to be opened only if things became very difficult. James would open the first 2 at the appropriate times. He would open the third in January of 1945, after the events in the Ardennes forest, when he needed to hear his mother's voice, telling him that he was stronger than he knew, and that she was proud of him regardless of what happened. The training at Camp Hood was both easier and harder than James had anticipated. Easier because the physical demands, while substantial, were not beyond what years of farm labor had prepared him for. He could march long distances, could endure heat and discomfort, could wake early and work late without complaint. Harder because of the social dynamics, the reality of being one of the few black soldiers in training alongside white soldiers from all over the country, many of whom had never interacted with black people as equals, and some of whom had very fixed ideas about how such interactions should proceed. He was assigned to the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the few integrated units in the United States military at that time, though the integration was far from complete or comfortable. The 761st was a tank destroyer battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, machines that represented a particular American approach to armored warfare. Where the Germans built heavily armored vehicles like the Tiger tank, the Americans built the Hellcat. Fast, maneuverable, with a powerful gun but relatively light armor. The philosophy was speed and firepower over protection, hit and run, rather than stand and slug it out. The Hellcat could reach speeds of 55 miles per hour on roads, making it the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the war. It mounted a 76mm gun that could penetrate most German armor if it could hit the right spot at the right angle. But its armor was thin, in some places less than 1 inch thick, which meant that enemy fire that would merely dent a Sherman tank could penetrate a Hellcat. The crews learned quickly that their survival depended on not being hit at all, which meant maneuver, cover, and ambush tactics rather than direct confrontation. James trained at Camp Hood through the blistering Texas summer of 1944, temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the sun beating down on the training fields with physical force. He learned to identify enemy vehicles by their silhouettes, could distinguish a Mark IV medium tank from a Mark V Panther from a Mark VI Tiger at 1,000 meters. He memorized the weak points of German armor, the side plates, the rear engine compartment, the thin armor on the turret ring. He practiced with the M18's 76mm gun until he could help load and fire in under 8 seconds, his hands moving automatically through the sequence of steps even when his mind was focused elsewhere. But the technical training was only part of the education at Camp Hood. He also learned about military hierarchy, about the often arbitrary nature of authority, about how men behave when given power over others. His drill sergeant, a man named Carson who hailed from Alabama and made no secret of his views on integration, assigned James to latrine duty more often than seemed statistically random. His bunk was inspected more thoroughly than others. His performance was criticized more harshly. His mistakes were punished more severely. James learned to endure this without complaint, not because he accepted it as right, but because he understood that showing anger or resentment would only make things worse. He kept his head down, performed his duties to the best of his ability, and found allies among the other soldiers who either did not share Carson's prejudices or who at least were willing to judge a man by his performance rather than his appearance. One such ally was Private First Class Marcus Thompson, a 22-year-old from Detroit who had worked in an automobile factory before the war. Marcus was white, came from a family of union organizers, and had a tendency to speak his mind regardless of consequences. He and James were assigned to the same gun crew for training purposes, and after 2 weeks of working together, Marcus had declared that James was the fastest loader he had worked with, and anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with him personally. This declaration, made loudly in the barracks one evening, had resulted in a fistfight between Marcus and another soldier, a fight that Marcus lost, but that somehow earned James a measure of grudging respect from some of the other men. The training at Camp Hood lasted from April through August of 1944. James learned not just how to operate and maintain the M18 Hellcat, but also how to read maps, how to use a compass, how to dig a proper defensive position, how to recognize the sound of different types of artillery, how to estimate distances without instruments, and dozens of other skills that the Army believed were necessary for survival in modern warfare. He also learned things that were not part of the official curriculum: how to make coffee strong enough to keep you awake through a night watch, how to keep your feet dry in wet conditions, how to sleep anywhere under any circumstances, how to tell when a man was about to break under pressure, and how to maintain hope when everything seemed hopeless. By November of 1944, James was in Europe. Having crossed the Atlantic on a Liberty ship in a convoy of several dozen vessels, a journey that took 2 weeks and involved constant submarine alerts, rough seas that left most of the soldiers seasick for days, and conditions so cramped that men slept in shifts because there were not enough bunks for everyone. The crossing was uneventful in the sense that they were not attacked, but it was terrifying nonetheless. The knowledge that death could come from beneath the waves at any moment, with no warning, no chance to fight back, just the explosion and the cold water and the end. They landed at Southampton on the southern coast of England, spent 2 weeks in a staging area being equipped and briefed, and then crossed the English Channel to France. By early December, the 761st Tank Battalion was in Belgium, positioned in what commanders considered a quiet sector along the German border. The assumption, based on intelligence reports and strategic assessments that would prove catastrophically wrong, was that the German army was exhausted, depleted, finished. They had been pushed back across France, had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, had seen their industry devastated by Allied bombing. The prevailing view was that the war in Europe would be over by spring at the latest, possibly by the end of the year, if everything went well. James and his fellow soldiers in the 761st Tank Battalion were positioned near the town of Saint-Vith, a small Belgian town that would become crucial in the coming battle. They were part of a thin defensive line that stretched across the Ardennes forest, an area considered unsuitable for major military operations due to its rough terrain and limited road network. This was where the army placed units that needed more training or were considered less critical, including several that had only recently arrived in Europe. The days in early December were cold, but not yet bitterly so, with temperatures hovering around freezing and occasional snow flurries that melted quickly. James and his squad conducted patrols, maintained their vehicles, wrote letters home, played cards, complained about the food, and tried to stay warm. It felt almost routine, almost safe, and that feeling was a dangerous illusion. James wrote letters to his family every few days, carefully crafted missives that said little about what he was actually experiencing, but that he hoped would reassure his mother that he was safe and well. He described the Belgian countryside, the friendliness of the local civilians, the quality of the food, which was actually much better than what he had grown up eating, though he did not mention that. He asked about his siblings, about the farm, about the small details of home life that seemed both incredibly distant and vitally important. He received letters from home irregularly, bundles of them arriving all at once after weeks of nothing, and he read each one multiple times, memorizing the details, trying to hold on to the connection to a world that felt increasingly unreal. Then, in the early morning darkness of December 16th, 1944, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, when the sky was still black and most soldiers were either sleeping or standing watch in a half-awake state, the German forces launched their largest offensive on the Western Front since the beginning of the war. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Germans called it, a name chosen to deceive Allied intelligence into thinking it was a defensive operation. The Allies would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge, named for the bulge it created in the Allied lines, as German forces punched through weak points and drove west toward the Meuse River and the vital port of Antwerp, the last desperate attempt by the German armed forces of that era to split the Allied lines, surround and destroy multiple Allied armies, and possibly force a negotiated peace that would leave them in control of at least part of their territorial gains. The offensive began with an artillery barrage of unprecedented intensity, thousands of guns firing simultaneously along an 85-mile front, shells screaming through the darkness and exploding with flashes of light that turned night briefly into a hellish parody of day. The sound was overwhelming, a physical pressure that made ears ring and made rational thought difficult. James Wright, sleeping in a barn that had been converted into temporary barracks, woke to the sound of the world ending, or so it seemed in those first confused moments. Soldiers stumbled from their sleeping places, grabbing weapons and equipment, trying to understand what was happening. Radio communications were chaotic, flooded with reports of attacks all along the line, of infiltrators behind the lines cutting phone cables and creating confusion, of overwhelming force hitting positions that had been considered safe. The fog was so thick that visibility was measured in meters rather than miles, and the smoke from the artillery only made it worse. James Wright learned about the offensive, the way most frontline soldiers learn about strategic developments, through the thunder of artillery that seemed to come from everywhere at once, through the rumors that spread faster than official communications and were often more accurate, through the urgent tone in the voices of officers who were trying to maintain calm while clearly being terrified themselves, and through the sudden orders to pack up and move immediately. The 761st Tank Battalion was rushed north toward the town of Bastogne, where American forces were being surrounded by advancing German columns that were moving faster than anyone had thought possible. The journey north was a nightmare that James would remember in fragments for the rest of his life. Icy roads that caused vehicles to slide and occasionally crash, refugees streaming south with terror in their eyes, civilians who had believed they were safe now fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry, pushing carts and wheelbarrows piled high with household goods, leading children by the hand, their faces showing the kind of fear that comes from realizing that the war they thought was ending had come back with a vengeance. The constant sound of distant explosions, sometimes so close that they could feel the pressure wave, sometimes distant thunder that suggested larger battles happening just over the horizon. James rode in the back of a supply truck, pressed between other soldiers who tried to joke about the situation, but could not quite hide the fear in their voices. Someone was saying that the Germans were finished. This was just a last gasp. They would be back in their defensive positions by the end of the week. Someone else was saying that they were all going to die, that the Germans had some new secret weapon, that High Command had completely failed to anticipate this. A third soldier was praying, not loudly but audibly, words in Spanish that James did not understand but whose meaning was clear enough. James kept his hands wrapped around his rifle, feeling the cold metal through his gloves, the weight of it somehow comforting, reminding himself of all his training, telling himself that he would do his job and trust that others would do theirs. What the training had not prepared him for, what no training could prepare anyone for, was the scale of what they were facing. The German offensive involved over 400,000 troops, the largest force they had assembled on the Western Front in over a year. Thousands of armored vehicles, from light reconnaissance vehicles to the heaviest tanks in their arsenal. Artillery pieces numbering in the thousands, a level of coordination and secrecy that Allied intelligence had believed impossible at this stage of the conflict. The Germans had hidden their preparations brilliantly, moving troops and equipment at night, maintaining radio silence, using the poor weather that grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft to mask their intentions. Among those armored vehicles were some of the most feared machines ever to roll across a European battlefield, the Tiger tanks. And not just the original Tiger, which was formidable enough, but the new model, officially designated the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausführung B, but known to everyone as the King Tiger or Tiger II. These were the most powerful tanks that had yet been fielded by any nation, representing the pinnacle of wartime German engineering and also in many ways the limitations of that engineering. The Tiger II was a legend even before James Wright encountered one up close. Soldiers who had seen them spoke in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or acts of divine intervention. It weighed 69 metric tons, nearly twice the weight of the American Sherman tank, and significantly heavier even than the original Tiger. Its frontal armor was 150 millimeters thick, effectively impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons at any combat range. The side armor was 80 millimeters. The rear armor was between 60 and 80 millimeters, depending on the location. The turret alone weighed 11 metric tons, more than many entire vehicles weighed. Its 88mm Kbk 43 L71 gun was one of the most powerful tank guns of the war, capable of penetrating the frontal armor of any Allied tank from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. The gun could fire armor-piercing rounds that weighed over 22 pounds and traveled at nearly 3,000 feet per second. In practical terms, this meant that a Tiger II could engage Allied tanks from ranges where the Allied tanks could not effectively return fire, could take hit after hit from enemy weapons and continue fighting, and could destroy multiple enemy vehicles in rapid succession if properly employed. American tankers had developed a saying about the Tiger, one that was repeated in training and in the field. It takes 5 Shermans to defeat 1 Tiger, 4 to die, drawing its attention while positioning themselves, and 1 to get a shot at its side or rear where the armor is thinner. This was not an exaggeration or a joke, but a tactical doctrine based on actual combat experience. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor except at very close range and with a perfect hit angle. The only reliable way to defeat a Tiger with Shermans was through numerical superiority and tactical coordination, sacrificing some tanks to create the opportunity for others to get a flanking shot. The 761st Tank Battalion's M18 Hellcats had a better chance than Sherman's. Their 76mm guns fired a heavier round at higher velocity and could penetrate Tiger armor if they could hit the right spot at the right angle. But that required speed, positioning, and a considerable amount of luck. The Hellcat's advantage was its mobility. It could outrun a Tiger, could position itself for a flank shot, could hit and retreat before the Tiger could bring its gun to bear. But if caught in a direct confrontation, if the Tiger got its gun on target first, the Hellcat's thin armor meant that one hit was usually fatal to the vehicle and everyone inside it. On December 18, 1944, Just after noon, when the winter sun was providing minimal warmth through the thick cloud cover and fog, James Wright's luck ran out, and then, paradoxically, and in a way that would seem impossible if it were not documented in multiple after-action reports, manifested in the most unexpected way possible. His squad had been separated from the main battalion during a chaotic withdrawal from an overrun position near the village of Houffalize, a small Belgian settlement that had changed hands multiple times in the previous 48 hours. 8 men, one partially disabled M18 Hellcat tank destroyer with transmission problems that caused it to lurch and grind whenever it tried to shift gears, trying to navigate forest roads that might or might not still be in Allied hands, with no radio contact to headquarters and only a rough map that was already outdated by the rapidly changing tactical situation. Sergeant Thomas Hayes was in command of the squad, a 34-year-old veteran of the North African campaign who had been wounded twice, decorated 3 times, and who had the perpetually exhausted look of a man who had seen too much but kept going anyway, because stopping was not an option. Hayes was from Pennsylvania, had been a coal miner before the war, and had a wife and 2 children he had not seen in over a year. He was the kind of non-commissioned officer that armies depend on, competent, experienced, able to make decisions under pressure, and able to maintain morale even when situations looked hopeless. Hayes had decided that their best chance was to make their way west and slightly south, trying to reconnect with friendly forces near Saint-Vith. They had stopped in a clearing in the forest to try to repair the Hellcat's transmission, or at least patch it well enough to keep moving. The vehicle's driver, a specialist named Rodriguez from Texas, was underneath the vehicle with Sergeant Hayes, trying to tighten bolts and adjust linkages, while the rest of the squad provided security and tried to stay alert despite fatigue and cold. They had been working for about 20 minutes when they heard it, a deep rumbling engine note that every Allied soldier in Europe had learned to dread. It was distinct from American engines, which had a higher-pitched, more mechanical sound. It was distinct even from other German vehicles, which generally had a sharp, aggressive tone. This was something else, a low, powerful, almost organic sound, like some great beast breathing. It was the sound of something massive and mechanical pushing through terrain that would stop lighter vehicles, the sound of immense weight and power moving with purpose. Sergeant Hayes, his hands still covered in transmission fluid, black and greasy up to his elbows, stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, head tilted, listening with the intensity of a man whose survival had often depended on identifying threats by sound alone. The forest was quiet except for that engine, no birds singing, no small animals moving through the underbrush, as if the wildlife had learned to flee from that particular sound. Then Hayes spoke 2 words that made every man's blood turn cold, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the still air. Heavy armor. The squad scattered immediately, following training and instinct. Standard doctrine when facing superior armor without your own armor. Operational was to take cover, let it pass if possible, engage only if you had absolutely no choice, and the tactical situation was favorable. The forest was thick here, old-growth pine trees that rose 40 or 50 feet before their first branches, trunks that were several feet in diameter, growing close enough together that a tank, even one as powerful as a Tiger, would have to stick to the roads or the wider paths between the trees. The underbrush was moderate, enough to hide a prone man, but not enough to stop a tracked vehicle. James Wright ran with Private First Class Marcus Thompson, the man who had become his closest friend in the unit, both of them moving in a crouch, trying to be quick while staying low. They found a depression in the ground about 50 meters from the road, a natural feature where water runoff had carved out a shallow trench over years or decades. The depression was partially hidden by fallen logs, the remnants of trees that had come down in storms, and by winter undergrowth that was brown and dead, but still provided some visual concealment. They pressed themselves into the cold earth, feeling the dampness seep through their uniforms, and waited. The sound grew louder, close enough now that James could feel it through the ground as well as hear it, a rhythmic vibration that spoke of immense weight and mechanical power. The tracks clinking and grinding against stones and frozen earth, the engine laboring slightly as it navigated the uneven terrain. Then he saw it, and the sight drove the breath from his lungs and made his stomach clench with pure, primal fear. The tiger emerged from the fog like a creature from nightmare, impossibly large, its dimensions somehow wrong in a way that the brain struggled to process. James had seen tigers in recognition training, had studied photographs and silhouettes, had heard the dimensions and specifications recited until he could repeat them in his sleep. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for the reality of one at close range, the physical presence of it, the way it dominated the space around it. It was painted in winter camouflage, irregular patterns of white and tan and dark green that had been applied recently and somewhat hastily, meant to help it blend with snow-covered terrain, though the snow had mostly melted in this area. The camouflage pattern would have made it harder to spot at a distance, especially in conditions of poor visibility, but here, at a range that James estimated at less than 60 meters, it only made the vehicle look more alien and menacing, like some predatory animal, marked with patterns meant to confuse prey. The long gun barrel extended from the turret like a lance, angled slightly downward as the tank navigated the road, its length giving it an almost aggressive posture even when stationary. The barrel was so long that it had to be supported by an external brace when the tank was not in action to prevent the weight from damaging the mounting. James could see the muzzle brake at the end of the barrel, the device that helped manage the tremendous recoil when the gun fired, and he found himself imagining what it would be like to see that gun fire at this range, the flash and the shockwave and then nothing. The tank moved slowly, cautiously, the commander's head visible in the cupola on top of the turret, scanning the forest with binoculars. James could see the man clearly enough to make out details. A young face, probably not much older than James himself, with several days of beard growth. The commander was wearing a field cap and headphones, and he was turning his head in a methodical pattern, checking sectors, looking for threats. Professional, disciplined, doing his job. James pressed himself flatter against the ground, trying to make himself invisible, trying not to breathe too loudly, very aware of his heart hammering against his ribs. The protocol was crystal clear in his mind, from countless training iterations. Stay hidden. Let it pass. Live to fight another day. Do not engage superior armor on foot unless you have no other option, and even then, only if you have the right weapons and the right tactical situation. James had neither. He had his M1 Garand rifle, which could not even scratch the paint on a Tiger tank. He had 2 hand grenades which might damage tracks or vision ports if he could get close enough, but getting that close would be effectively suicidal. He had absolutely no way to effectively fight that vehicle. The Tiger had at least 5 crew members inside: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator. They were surrounded by armor that could shrug off most of what the Americans could throw at them. Sitting inside a machine that represented thousands of hours of engineering and industrial capacity, armed with a gun that could eliminate any Allied tank before that tank could even get into effective firing range. You did not fight a Tiger on foot unless you had no other option, and James's training had emphasized that reality repeatedly and emphatically. The tank was going to pass them. James could see that now. It was following the road, moving at perhaps 8 or 10 miles per hour, slow and cautious but not stopping. James felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost painful. They would wait 10 minutes after it disappeared, standard procedure, then find their way back to American lines, report the sighting and the direction of movement. Let someone with appropriate weapons deal with it. Headquarters would want to know that there was a Tiger in this area, would probably send aircraft if the weather cleared, or multiple tank destroyers to hunt it. But that would not be James's problem. He would survive this encounter, would have a story to tell, would live to see another day. Then Private Thompson's foot slipped against a piece of deadwood. It was such a tiny movement, barely perceptible, his boot scraping against weathered wood that crumbled slightly under the pressure. Under normal circumstances, it would have been inaudible, would have been lost in the ambient sounds of the forest. But the winter forest was eerily quiet, and the Tiger's engine had just downshifted, reducing its volume as the vehicle slowed slightly to negotiate a turn in the road. In that moment of relative silence, the sound of Thompson's boot against the wood carried clearly, a sharp scraping noise that lasted perhaps half a second, but that might as well have been a gunshot for all the attention it attracted. James saw the Tiger's commander hear it, saw the man's head snap around, eyes searching the forest, the methodical pattern of observation suddenly becoming focused and intent. The commander said something into his microphone, and the turret began to traverse, the massive structure rotating with a mechanical whine that James could hear even at this distance, the long gun swinging toward their position like the finger of death itself. James knew with absolute certainty, with a clarity that transcended thought and entered the realm of pure knowledge, that they had been spotted. Maybe the commander had not seen them exactly, but he had heard something, was investigating, and that gun was going to point directly at their position. At this range, the Tiger would not even need to use an armor-piercing round. A high-explosive shell would kill them both, even if it hit 10 meters away. The blast and shrapnel would see to that. They had perhaps 5 seconds, maybe 10 if they were very lucky, before that gun was aligned and the gunner inside the tank confirmed the target, and the loader finished loading a round and the commander gave the order to fire. What happened next occurred in the space of perhaps 5 seconds, but James would remember it for the rest of his life in crystal-clear detail, each moment stretched and examined from every angle. The Tiger's turret continued to turn. The gun was going to point directly at their position. At this range, the high-explosive shell would kill them even if it hit 10 meters away. The blast and shrapnel would see to that. James could surrender, put his hands up, hope the crew would take prisoners. But he had heard the stories about what happened to captured soldiers during the confusion of this offensive. Some were treated properly, according to the rules of war. Others simply disappeared into the chaos, especially soldiers who looked like James. His hand, moving seemingly of its own accord, closed around the Coca-Cola bottle that had been in his coat pocket. He had found it that morning in an abandoned American position, still half full of frozen Coke that had expanded and cracked the glass. He had kept it because soldiers kept strange things as talismans, little pieces of home in a foreign land of fear and noise. The turret swung. The gun barrel was almost aligned with their position. James stood up, stepped out from behind the log, and threw the Coca-Cola bottle with every ounce of strength he possessed. His mind was not thinking tactically. He was not planning. He was simply doing the only thing his terrified, desperate brain could conceive, making some kind of action. Any action, instead of waiting to be eliminated. The bottle arced through the air, tumbling end over end, catching the weak winter light filtering through the fog. It struck the Tiger's gun barrel about 2/3 of the way down its length. The glass shattered with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud. Frozen Coke sprayed across the barrel and onto the front armor. Then James heard it, shouting inside the tank. Panicked. Urgent German voices. The turret stopped traversing. The engine, which had been idling with that characteristic deep rumble, suddenly roared to full power. The tracks clawed at the forest floor, and the 69-ton machine lurched backward, crashing through underbrush, desperate to retreat. James stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. The Tiger, the most feared tank on the European battlefield, was fleeing from an empty Coca-Cola bottle. Private Thompson grabbed James's arm and pulled him back into cover, both of them pressed against the ground, listening as the Tiger continued to retreat. The sound of its engine faded, moving back the way it had come, and then there was silence, except for the drip of water from pine branches and the sound of James's own heart hammering against his ribs. The explanation, when James finally understood it, was simultaneously mundane and profound, a perfect illustration of how psychology and circumstance can override training and technology. The Tiger tank crew had been in Belgium for 6 days. They were part of the 6th Panzer Army, the northern pincer of the German offensive. They had experienced the overwhelming power of Allied air superiority when the weather cleared. They had been strafed by P-47 Thunderbolts, watched helplessly as Allied fighter bombers destroyed supply convoys, saw the sky fill with enemy aircraft whenever the fog lifted. What they feared most, what every German armored vehicle crew in the Ardennes feared most, was the weapon that American ground attack aircraft had begun using with devastating effectiveness, the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket known as the HVAR or Holy Moses by the pilots who fired them. These rockets could penetrate the top armor of even a Tiger tank, the one place where the armor was thinnest. The Tiger crew, hearing the crack of breaking glass against their gun barrel, seeing the splash of dark liquid across their front armor, reached the instantaneous and perfectly reasonable conclusion that they were being marked by an Allied aircraft or ground observer with a smoke marker for an imminent rocket or artillery strike. The splash pattern, the sound, the suddenness of it, all matched their worst fear. Their training and their experience told them that marked vehicles died within seconds or minutes. So they retreated, quickly, following the doctrine that had been drilled into them. If you are marked for air attack and cannot identify the observer to suppress them, relocate immediately. The commander made a tactical decision in 3 seconds that saved his crew's lives based on incorrect information, and in doing so, demonstrated that even the most advanced military machine is only as effective as the human beings operating it under conditions of incomplete information and sustained stress. James Wright and Marcus Thompson stayed hidden for another 20 minutes before carefully making their way back toward American lines. They found Sergeant Hayes and the rest of their squad 2 hours later. The M18 Hellcat's transmission had been temporarily repaired, enough to limp back to friendly positions. When James reported what had happened, Sergeant Hayes stared at him for a long moment, then asked him to repeat it. James did, with Marcus Thompson confirming every detail. Hayes wrote it down in his after-action report, though he noted that the incident was difficult to verify and possibly the result of combat stress. The report made its way up the chain of command, where it was filed along with thousands of other reports from those chaotic December days. The story might have ended there, a strange anecdote buried in military archives, except for what happened 2 days later. The 761st Tank Battalion, reunited and back to operational strength, was positioned near the town of Saint-Vith, trying to hold a defensive line against continued German advances. Intelligence reported a Tiger tank operating in the area, and based on the description and markings, it was likely the same vehicle James had encountered. This time, the engagement went according to military doctrine. 2 M18 Hellcats, using their superior speed and maneuverability, caught the Tiger as it was negotiating a turn on an icy road. They hit it from both sides simultaneously, multiple rounds striking the thinner side armor. The Tiger was disabled, its crew forced to abandon the vehicle. Among the captured crew was the commander, a 32-year-old Oberleutnant named Friedrich Weber. During interrogation, conducted by a German-speaking American intelligence officer, Weber mentioned the incident from 2 days earlier. He described being marked for air attack while on patrol in the forest, explaining his decision to withdraw rather than risk his vehicle and crew. When the intelligence officer, intrigued, asked for more details about this marking, Weber described the sound, the splash pattern, the suddenness of it. The officer, who had read Sergeant Hayes's report that same morning as part of his preparation for the interrogation, made the connection. Private James Wright was brought in to meet with the intelligence officer that evening. The officer, a captain named David Rosenberg from New York, who had been a criminal lawyer before the war, explained what he had learned. Then he asked James a question that would stay with him forever. "Do you understand what happened?" Captain Rosenberg asked, lighting a cigarette and offering one to James, who declined. "You made him believe something that wasn't true, and he acted on that belief in a way that saved your life and Thompson's. That's not luck, Private. That's psychological warfare, even if you didn't know you were conducting it." James, still trying to process everything, asked the question that had been bothering him since the moment the Tiger retreated. But why didn't he shoot first and retreat after? Why assume it was a marker instead of just some random impact? Captain Rosenberg explained the context. The German forces in the Ardennes were operating under conditions of increasing desperation. They had achieved tactical surprise, yes, had pushed back Allied lines and created chaos, but they were doing so with fuel supplies that were already critically low and under the constant threat of Allied air power. Every German soldier knew that when the weather cleared, the aircraft would come, and there was almost nothing their ground forces could do about it. The German crews had seen what happened to vehicles that were marked. They had seen the rockets, the bombs, the artillery that would follow within minutes. In that context, Weber's decision was not cowardice or panic. It was tactical prudence based on pattern recognition and threat assessment. He believed his vehicle was marked because the alternative, that some random event had occurred that merely sounded like marking, seemed less likely given the overall operational picture. What you did, Captain Rosenberg concluded, was accidentally exploit their most significant vulnerability. Not their armor, not their fuel situation, not their supply lines. Their fear. Their knowledge that we own the sky when the weather permits, and that knowledge has made them reactive and defensive, even when they are on the offensive. The story of James Wright and the Coca-Cola bottle spread through the 761st Tank Battalion, then through the wider American forces in the area. It became a tale told in foxholes and warming tents, each retelling adding small embellishments, until the official after-action report and James's own consistent version provided an anchor to the actual events. What made the story resonate was not just its unlikelihood, but what it represented. The Battle of the Bulge was a terrifying experience for Allied forces, a sudden reminder that the war was not won, that the enemy was still capable of major offensives, that victory was not inevitable. In that context, a story about a 17-year-old soldier defeating advanced military technology with an empty soft drink bottle became something more than just an anecdote. It became a parable about resourcefulness, about the power of psychological factors in warfare, about how the most sophisticated weapon systems are still operated by human beings, subject to stress and fear and incomplete information. The Battle of the Bulge raged for another month. The German offensive ultimately failed, unable to reach its objectives, bled dry by Allied resistance and overwhelming Allied material superiority. The weather cleared after the first week, and Captain Rosenberg's prediction came true. The Allied aircraft came, hundreds of them, turning the roads into graveyards of destroyed vehicles. The German armored forces that had punched through the American lines were systematically isolated and defeated, not primarily through ground combat, but through interdiction of their supplies and constant attack from the air. James Wright survived the battle. He survived the war. He returned to Mississippi in November of 1945, 20 years old in reality, though he felt decades older in experience. He used the benefits from the GI Bill to attend college, something that would have been impossible before the war, and became a teacher, specializing in history with a particular focus on World War II. He told the story of the Coca-Cola bottle exactly 4 times in the 53 years between the end of the war and his passing in 1998. Once to his wife, when they were dating, and she asked about his war service. Once to his son, when the boy was 14 and struggling with a bully at school. Once to a historian researching integrated units in World War II, who interviewed him in 1987. And once to a class of high school students in 1996, when the school invited him to speak on Veterans Day. Each time he told it, he emphasized the same points. It was not heroism, he would say. It was desperation and luck, but it taught me something important about fear and perception. That German commander was not a coward. He was a professional making a decision based on the information he had and the context he was operating in. The fact that his information was wrong and his context led him to the wrong conclusion does not diminish his professionalism. It just means that in war, as in life, we often act on incomplete information, and sometimes chance determines the outcome as much as skill or courage. To his son, during that conversation about the bully, he added something else. Sometimes, he said, the solution to a problem is not about being stronger or tougher. Sometimes it is about changing the other person's perception of the situation. That tiger outweighed me by about 69,960 kilograms and had armor I could not penetrate with anything I was carrying. But for a few seconds, I changed how its crew saw their situation, and that was enough. The historian who interviewed James in 1987 was writing a book about African American soldiers in World War II, exploring how the war had served as a catalyst for the civil rights movement that would follow. She was particularly interested in James's experience as one of the youngest soldiers in an integrated unit, serving at a time when the military and the country were still deeply segregated. James told her that the 761st Tank Battalion was not a perfect model of integration. There were tensions, prejudices that men brought with them from civilian life, unequal treatment in various forms. But there was also something else, he said. When you are in that foxhole, when that tiger is turning its gun toward your position, nobody cares what you look like. They care whether you can do your job, whether you will stand with them, whether you can be trusted when things go bad. The war did not eliminate prejudice, but it did create situations where people had to see past it or not survive. The historian asked him about the immediate aftermath of the incident with the Coca-Cola bottle. Were there any racial incidents, any questioning of his story because of his race? James thought for a moment before answering. Captain Rosenberg was Jewish, he said. Sergeant Hayes was from Kentucky, came from a family that had fought for the Confederacy, but he wrote up my report without changing a word and made sure I got credit for it. Marcus Thompson, who was with me and confirmed everything, was treated the same as me, even though he was white. I think maybe that war had a way of scrambling people's priorities. We were all just trying to survive and win, and individual actions mattered more than background. It was not perfect, but it was different from what came before or what we went back to after. The Battle of the Bulge became known as one of the turning points of World War II, not because it changed the outcome. The German forces were already strategically defeated, but because it demonstrated certain realities about modern warfare that would influence military thinking for decades afterward. First, it showed the decisive importance of air power in mid-20th century warfare. The German offensive made significant gains while weather grounded Allied aircraft, but collapsed rapidly once the skies cleared. This lesson would shape military doctrine and procurement for the next 50 years. Second, it demonstrated the importance of logistics and industrial capacity. The German forces ran out of fuel before they ran out of courage or determination. Their offensive failed not because they were defeated in direct combat, though they were, but because they could not sustain their advance against an enemy with vastly superior supply lines and production capacity. Third, and perhaps most relevant to James Wright's experience, it illustrated the psychological dimensions of warfare. Morale, perception, fear, and the interpretation of ambiguous information all played crucial roles in determining outcomes. The most advanced technology in the world, represented by vehicles like the Tiger tank, could be rendered ineffective by psychological factors that undermined the crew's willingness or ability to use that technology effectively. Military analysts studying the battle in subsequent years noted numerous instances where German forces retreated from positions they could have held, where Allied forces maintained positions they should have abandoned, where the outcome of engagements was determined as much by what people believed was happening as by what was actually happening. War, they concluded, is not just physics and logistics, it is psychology. The specific incident involving James Wright and the Tiger tank became a case study, though not a widely known one, in military psychology courses. It appeared in classified after-action analyses, in training materials about the importance of maintaining situational awareness and verifying threats before reacting. The incident itself was almost too perfect an illustration of how perception and context can override tactical superiority. Friedrich Weber, the Tiger commander, survived the war. He was held as a prisoner until 1947, then returned to Germany and worked in civil engineering, helping rebuild the infrastructure that the war had destroyed. In 1973, as part of a documentary project on the Battle of the Bulge, he was interviewed about his experiences. He mentioned the incident with what he still believed at the time was a marking round, describing his decision to withdraw as the correct tactical choice given the information available to him. A researcher on the project, who had come across the American after-action reports, informed him that it had actually been a thrown bottle. Weber's reaction, preserved on film, was a complex mixture of emotions: disbelief, then laughter, then a kind of rueful acknowledgement. Of course, he said in German, which the documentary translated, "In war we make the best decisions we can with what we know. I would make the same decision again under the same circumstances. That is all anyone can do." He never knew the name of the soldier who threw the bottle, and James Wright never learned the name of the tank commander until years after both events, when a researcher connected the dots and informed him. By then, both men were in their 50s, living quiet lives far from the frozen forests of Belgium, where their paths had intersected for a few terrifying seconds. The technological legacy of the Tiger tank is well documented. It influenced post-war tank design, demonstrated the potential and limitations of heavy armor, and became a symbol of German engineering prowess. But it also became a symbol of something else, the reality that no amount of technological superiority can fully compensate for strategic disadvantages, that the best individual weapon system cannot win a war if the broader context, the logistics, the air power, the industrial capacity favors the opponent. The 761st Tank Battalion continued to serve throughout the remainder of the war, participating in the crossing of the Rhine and the final advances into Germany. They performed with distinction, earning unit citations and individual decorations. The fact that they were an integrated unit became less notable over time as the army slowly, grudgingly, began to move toward full integration in the years after the war. James Wright remained in touch with several members of his old unit for decades after the war. Sergeant Thomas Hayes became a police officer in Philadelphia and exchanged Christmas cards with James for 30 years. Marcus Thompson returned to Detroit, worked in the automobile industry, and occasionally drove down to Mississippi to visit James and his family. Captain David Rosenberg returned to practicing law in New York and later became a judge, and he mentioned James's case in an interview about his time in military intelligence, though without using names. These connections, these relationships that formed under the pressure of shared danger and common purpose, represented something important about that generation's experience. They had been thrown together by circumstance, had learned to work together out of necessity, and had discovered in the process that many of the barriers they had been taught to believe were natural and inevitable were actually artificial and surmountable. The Coca-Cola bottle itself, or what remained of it, was not recovered. It shattered on impact with the Tiger's gun barrel, and its fragments fell somewhere in the Belgian forest, where they probably still rest, buried under decades of leaf litter and forest growth. No monument marks the spot. No plaque commemorates the event. It is a moment that exists now only in documents, memories, and the ripples it created in the lives of those involved. But the story itself, the parable of the 17-year-old soldier and the Tiger tank and the empty bottle, has lived on in various forms. It appears in books about the Battle of the Bulge, usually as a footnote or an anecdote, illustrating the chaos and unpredictability of warfare. It has been told and retold in military training environments as a lesson about the importance of threat verification and the dangers of assumption. It has been referenced in discussions of psychological warfare and the role of perception in military operations. What makes the story endure, perhaps, is its essential humanity. It is not a story about good defeating evil through moral superiority. It is not a story about technology triumphing over barbarism. It is a story about two groups of human beings, both far from home, both frightened, both trying to survive in a situation that neither fully controlled or understood. One group made an assumption based on reasonable interpretation of ambiguous information. The other group benefited from that assumption through pure chance. And both groups were shaped by the experience in ways they carried forward into peacetime. James Wright, in his final interview before his passing, was asked what he wanted people to understand about his war experience. He thought for a long moment, his hands age-spotted and trembling slightly, folded in his lap. Then he spoke with the careful precision of a man who had spent a lifetime thinking about how to express complex ideas clearly. "I want people to understand that war is not what we see in movies or read in most books," he said. "It is not glorious. It is not even particularly heroic most of the time. It is terrifying and confusing, and mostly about trying to survive until the next day. The fact that I survived a meeting with a Tiger tank by throwing a bottle at it does not make me a hero. It makes me lucky. The real story is not about me defeating the tank. It is about how thin the line is between survival and its opposite, how much of what happens in war is chance rather than skill, and how important it is that we remember these things so we are not eager to repeat them." He paused, then added, "And maybe the story is also about how fear affects everyone, regardless of which side they are on or what advantages they might have. That German crew was inside the most powerful tank in the world at that time, but they were still afraid. That fear, as much as any weapon, determined what happened that day. Understanding that, really understanding it, might be important for people trying to understand war itself." The interviewer asked if he had any regrets about his war service. James smiled, a small, complicated expression. "I regret that the war happened," he said. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret the waste of it, all those lives, all that destruction, all that suffering. But do I regret serving? No. I did what I believed was right, what my country needed. The fact that my country did not always treat me or people who looked like me fairly before or after the war does not change that. I am allowed to criticize my country and still have served it faithfully. Both things are true." In the final accounting, the story of James Wright and the Tiger tank is a small moment in a vast conflict, a footnote to a footnote in the enormous history of World War II. More than 60 million people perished in that war. Entire cities were erased. The political map of the world was redrawn. The atomic age began. Against that backdrop, what is one 17-year-old soldier throwing a bottle at a tank? But perhaps it matters precisely because it is small, because it is human scale, because it is a moment where individual actions and random chance intersected in a way that was comprehensible and even, in its way, absurd. The grand sweep of history is important, but it is made up of millions of individual moments, most of them unrecorded, where people made decisions or took actions that seemed insignificant at the time but carried consequence. James Wright did not win the Battle of the Bulge by throwing that bottle. He did not change the course of the war. The Tiger tank he encountered was disabled 2 days later by conventional military tactics and superior numbers. The German offensive failed because of factors far beyond the actions of one teenage soldier in one Belgian forest. All of this is true, but also true is that James Wright survived that moment when he might not have, and he went on to live a full life, to teach hundreds of students, to raise a family, to be a voice for his community and his generation. The German crew of that Tiger also survived that moment when they might not have, and they too went on to rebuild lives in the aftermath of the war. These survival stories, multiplied across millions of individuals, are how history is actually experienced rather than just recorded. The Coca-Cola bottle, that mundane object that became for a few seconds a weapon of psychological warfare, represents something about American culture in that era, and perhaps still. It was a consumer product, mass-produced, distributed globally, recognizable, carrying with it associations of home and normalcy, even in a war zone. The fact that James kept it, that he had it available to throw at a critical moment, speaks to the small comforts soldiers sought in impossible situations. The fact that it worked, that it changed the outcome of that encounter, was pure chance. But chance, in war as in life, is often determinative. The philosopher who said fortune favors the prepared mind might have added that fortune also sometimes favors the desperate act, the improvisation born of necessity, the moment when conventional solutions have failed and anything becomes worth trying. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.